Hinge cuts are an awesome tool of deer habitat management, but should you be using them on your property? I've been to a lot of properties. I've seen hundreds of hinge cut bedding areas across many different states. And it's a pretty cool process because when I'm on a property, I feel like I learn every property I visit. And it gives me a really good opportunity to look at what people have done, what people have created on their land, including hinge cuts and bedding areas, and what's worked and what has not worked. Hinge cuts are a great tool. They're a viable tool, and there is a balance that should be applied when using that tool, any tool. For example, I love water holes, but just because we love water holes or mock scrapes, whatever it might be, doesn't mean that I put a water hole or mock scrape on every property that I visit or on the lands that I hunt too. There is a balance with all of this. Now, hinge cuts, what I'd like you to consider is, for one, listening to these next 10 ways that if you hinge cut using these ways on your property, your hinge cuts can fail, or you're starting behind right off the bat. There's always remedies to these things, but a lot of times if you create these 10 hinge cuts, or you use hinge cuts in these manners, you use these hinge cut strategies, a lot of times you're setting yourself up for failure. And my whole goal with any of the videos that I create, any of the content I create, is to actually help you based on a very, very high level of experience. Now, hinge cuts, one of the largest, the first, number one, and I'll start from number 1 to 10. They're not in any order of importance, but at the same time, number one of the most common problems I see on parcels with hinge cuts is that hinge cuts are made, and I've seen a lot of these hinge cuts. You have to remember, going back, I've seen a lot of hinge cuts that people have paid to have professionally created on their land. They've sometimes paid thousands of dollars to have these done. And we're going to go through these and why they're not working for landowners, because a lot of times I'm coming in after the landowner saying, paid for this, not working. And there's always simple remedies why. First one, the hinge cuts are not getting enough light. So you're taking trees that are 30 feet tall, 20 feet tall, whatever the diameter is, you're putting them on the ground, you're hinging them, and then once you hinge them, you look to the southerly sky. If you make a 90-degree window, that's about 8 to 9 hours of sunlight a day. Those hinge cuts need several hours. So you can kind of range it out. If you have your hinge cuts right here and you look to the southerly sky, you can see I'm getting 20 degrees here, 30 degrees here, 10 degrees, 15 degrees. You have plenty of sunlight then. But if you look to the southerly sky, like on a lot of hinge cut bedding areas that I see, and there's no sunlight, there's no canopy reduced so that sunlight can actually get to those hinge cuts are going to die. You're wasting those trees, you're wasting those resources, no matter how you cut them. Doesn't matter if you cut them right or wrong, whatever it is, or if it's in the right spot. You're wasting those timber resources. Now, number two, huge, and this is one I'm going to emphasize over and over again, and I already have in a lot of my hinge cut and bedding videos. Hinge cuts should rarely be this high. There's so much information out there online that is really bad if you follow it, as far as hinge cuts being cut head high. Not only is it dangerous, think about hinge cuts. Hinge cuts are providing side cover and they're providing food. And so if you create these hinge cuts that are this high, then both the cover and the food is starting above the deer's head, above the deer's need for browse and for side cover. Think 3 feet when it comes to deer. They're at this level. Your hinge cut should be about waist high. Now, at times you have a ridge system, you have a flat right here, and you want those deer to bed on that flat. It might be that you cut a hinge cut high because it's only trees that are available just down the slope, and you need that hinge right here because, again, you're trying to create that hinge to provide side cover to that deer. So you have to, on that down slope, you might cut a couple feet higher. So then now that hinge is at head level to that deer right here. That's about the only time you want high hinge cuts. Now, it might be that you're trying to create a border for a neighbor that's looking into your property. And I've seen hinge cuts that people have cut out of a front end loader bucket on a tractor because they want them 10 feet high because that was the line that people were looking onto their property from. There are exceptions to this, but when it comes to deer bedding areas, please, please do not cut high. And at the same time, you really want those bedding areas, and there's reasons for this too going forward, but browse needs to start at head level for deer, and so does cover. So I want this hinge about this height right here, so that the browse that comes off from that cutting, it provides food to deer, and also the cover that grows off that covering, let alone the horizontal log that's there, provides cover to deer. So food and cover needs to start at hip high, not head high. That is a big no-no if you're creating bedding areas on your land, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit. Now, number 3, I can't tell you how many landowners I've been to that they're creating these hinge cuts. They want to create these hinge cuts. I show up at their cabin in the morning, their house in the morning, their land in the morning, and we're out in their land, and they're raring to go. They're ready to cut hinge cuts because everyone talks about hinge cut, hinge cut, hinge cut. That's what people need, bedding areas. They're ready to go. They have their habitat hooks from Nick Nation in southern Michigan. He sells these habitat hooks. They're awesome. I've used them for years, and it's a great tool. But then they don't need habitat, or they don't need hinge cuts on their land. Either their timber's too small, not the right size, or they just don't need hinge cuts. It's a low priority for creating bedding on their land because it might be the bedding area is going to be created by timber harvest. They might need to cut some large trees down first randomly on their property to put structure on the ground and to open up canopy. Those hinge cuts might be a really low priority. They're raring to go because they hear all about hinge cuts. And what I found across the country is that only 25%, roughly 20, 30, whatever it might be, but a pretty low percentage of all lands need hinge cuts. Again, hinge cuts, great tool in the bucket of habitat management, doesn't mean that you need to use them on every single property. Now the 4th one, and this will ruffle some feathers too, but the hinge cut canopies you see online, with the theory that this buck or deer in general want to crawl under that canopy and that they need somehow protection for birds and planes above, or that they prefer that canopy. Now I can say that a cedar clump up in the UP of Michigan, northern areas, northern Minnesota, Wisconsin, cedar clumps surrounded by tag alder, they do prefer to get under. They have snow hindrance cover, and they're using the side cover of all that tag alder around them, or hardwood regeneration, as the important cover that they need. And then a lot of times they're using that because it's lifted up a little bit off the ground. They can sit on that platform, and then they have the snow hindrance cover of the conifer. That's a different story. That's more natural. We've actually had to go in a large canopy area that someone paid thousands of dollars to create, several on their property, and then we go in and cut those up. And so 3 or 4 years later, that canopy's been smashed to the ground. They had a little bit of bedding to begin with, but deer do not prefer to have that bedding. Obviously, if they needed a canopy to bed all across the country, there'd be a lot of deer that wouldn't have that bedding. So this 4th concern of hinge cutting, the big trampoline effect, I've seen deer avoid those areas on 50% of the properties that they're put on completely. And you can imagine up north where we have predation, those deer do not want to be pinned into these little tight areas that they can't get out of. I've seen this in Iowa, seen it in Kansas. I've seen it all around the country where they create these canopies. Sure, they're a great, cool trampoline. You see all the pictures of the summer trampoline effect where deer like to get under there and get some shade. I've even had clients that have literally gone in there and jacked the canopy up so that they can actually fit deer underneath now because it's sagged over several years. They'll put treated 2x4s or 4x4s underneath against a solid log, lift that up, and they're trying to keep that canopy maintained. And let's think about it. If you take all your timber material and you create a canopy on the top of a knoll, now you used all your side cover that could have been there to create that canopy. The food starts at our head level and up. Now the deer don't have food, and when they're at that knoll, they don't have any cover. And let's face it, in November when they have heavy winds coming in from the northwest and it's cold, they don't bed under that at all. I've been on a property around one in Iowa last year. It's a 1/4 mile long ridge, finger ridge. Canopy bedding all the way across the top. They'd paid a lot of money for. All that covers to the side. So during November and December, the landowners would ask me, why are the deer not bedding there? They're bedding on the downwind side of the cover in the hinges where the logs were laying below that. And depending on which way the wind was blowing, they bed on one side or the other. I have feedback from clients all over the country on that, where they'll bed on that outside edge and completely under the canopy, not under the canopy, not in the canopy. And so then all the travel corridors are trying to create to move deer through that canopy or to expecting deer to bed in that canopy. They're not bedding in, and it all goes back to there's no side cover, there's no food, all the food is starting here. And so then there's a lot of maintenance to that too. And that's another point. Now, a fifth problem I see with hinge cutting, and I see this quite often, is just simply hinge cutting the wrong tree species. You never want a hinge cut conifer, and that includes cedar, any cedar, white cedar, red cedar, any kind of pine. Doesn't matter if it's Scotch pine, red pine, white pine, jack pine, you just don't cut it. Austrian pine, you don't cut it. Aspen, you don't hinge cut. Now, I've seen exceptions to these, and I've even prescribed exceptions to these where you're trying to hinge cut and you're using a specific type of plunge cutting and hinge cutting to where you're creating a really thick border edge. And the reason you're not hinge cutting these is they don't live when you hinge cut them. These trees don't. And so there are exceptions to all these rules, but except for maybe the canopy, low hinge cuts, that kind of thing. But cutting the wrong tree species can, again, it's no different than cutting the right species and not getting sunlight into it, and it won't grow and it just dies and lays there. It's the same with cutting the wrong species, even if it's in the right location, even if you get sun to it, because you're creating a situation where, for one, they typically never hinge unless you have a lot of skill to do so and keep them on the log. And two, you're not getting that regeneration. For example, aspen needs to be clear cut. All the regeneration takes place from the root system, the lateral root system. And so just cut the tree down, let it regenerate. Now, there might be times where you're cutting conifer down. It's better just to cut it down, let it regenerate, use the logs for cover if you're not harvesting them, but you don't need to take that extra time to hinge cut in those areas. Ironwood, you can hinge cut ironwood, but it's just gonna die most of the time. And so there's a lot of these species that you're cutting, you're not getting the full regeneration, you're not getting any browse. Now, it might be that you're cutting these to get sunlight to the ground, but that's different. You can just whack them down. You don't need to spend the extra time to cut them or hinge cut them. Just cut them down as safely as you can cut them down, and that will work the best. There are more trees that you can hinge cut than not. Some of my favorites, soft maple, basswood, those are great. Shagbark hickory, very good. White oak, red oak. You know, there's trees that are marginal for hinge cutting or very good, but in the end, you can hinge cut most tree species, and I like to do that before leaf out. If you have any oak on your property, you want to not hinge cut once you see those buds starting to open up on those oaks, and then you give it about 3 months. It is actually safe to go back and cut. There's not an April 15th date that you can't cut with oak on your property. It's when those buds are starting to form and open up. There's no certain magical date every year. It depends on the winter, it depends on the spring. But again, try avoiding conifers, spruce, cedar, ironwood. There's some trees like that you shouldn't be hinge cutting, and just expect those are going to die, even if you can somehow get those to cut. And you see that online, how to cut those and get those to that certain cut that'll be effective and stand up. Now, once you have your hinge cuts cut, and let's say you do this right, you know, what I'm doing is creating that maze and pocket effect. So I don't want any dead ends within that hinge cut. But once you have those hinge cuts down and you've cut them waist high, it's in the right spot, and you've created this nice mess of whitetail habitat improvement, then I want to make sure that I go back and all those trails and corridors that I've created through there. And again, I don't want any canopy. I don't want it in the beds. I don't want it over the travel corridors. I don't want any canopy over that, because if it falls in, it can ruin the whole bedding spot in that location. So I'm cleaning it out. Now, it might be that you clean it out with a DR brush trimmer. It might be that you spray it down with a ground clear herbicide. Even using, once it's cut, you could clear it with Roundup or 2,4-D combination. And that's in those high locations. If it's a wet area, you don't want to do that. But maintaining that is simply just going in there and cleaning it up every year. You can clean it up during the summer, so pretty easily to do, but it can get choked out with briars and regeneration so thick that deer sometimes don't use it. So when you go in there and clean it all up in this maze and pocket, then it works out really well. When you're cleaning that out, just maintain it every year. Very easy to do so once you've done it right. Now, a seventh way that I see a lot of hinge cut areas fail or potentially fail is you're adding food within that bedding area and within that travel corridor and within that movement. Doesn't matter if you're planting apple trees in there or if you're putting clover down, alfalfa down in the areas between your hinge cuts, I do not recommend it. The reason for is this is a bedding area. Deer need daytime browse. That means hardwood regeneration, briars, woody shrub tips, acorns, chestnuts, whatever it might be. They need that woody browse component, and I consider acorns and chestnuts to be that woody browse. They're hard to digest browse, and those are types of tree species, acorns, chestnuts. You put those back in the bedding areas. You keep the soft mass, including apples, pears, plums, persimmons, whatever it might be, with your food plots and with that green forage outside of your bedding areas, outside of your travel corridors. The reason for that is I don't want that deer to get filled up on high quality, soft mass, clover, alfalfa, whatever it might be, plums, pears, apples in that bedding area, so that it doesn't encourage him to move to my green food sources and to my food plots that I want him to pattern his afternoon food source movement to every single day. And it might be that you give them so much food back in their bedding areas that they don't need to go to your food plots, they go somewhere else. They go to an ag field, so I want that definition of travel every day. Keep the soft mast out of the bedding areas, not a good idea, or travel corridors. I want those deer to focus on my food sources, my green food sources, my high quality soft mast every afternoon, the entire season, and you can build that. But if they have that in their bedding areas, then why do they need to move? So very important to take that out of the equation if you're considering planting, or if you're getting advice to plant back in your bedding areas. You want to keep quality food with quality food, and hard mass with hard mass, browse, woody regeneration. That's all hard to digest for them. They want to hit that green in the afternoon, and it's great to keep that stuff out of your bedding areas, out of your travel corridors, and out of your hinge cuts.
Never.
Now, an eighth way that your hinge cuts could fail is if you're not capturing the full potential and opportunity that you have after you cut your hinge cuts. Hinge cutting on top of hinge cutting is a great practice. So imagine up in your bedding areas, you put them in the right location, they're open, the deer can move through them, you've kept them maintained, you've kept the soft mass out of there, the deer are using them, they're happy, they're moving from there to your food plots every day. And then all of a sudden you start getting almost pole timber off the side of those hinge cuts. They can get to 2 inches, 3 inches just off that tree, and that tree could live for decades after you hinge cut it. And you're not hinge cutting it all the way through to cut that total cambium layer. If you're using a hinge cut tool, you can simply cut that typically halfway, a tree that's 6 to 7 inches in diameter on down. You hinge cut that, cut it from the back, someone's pushing on it with the tool, and you don't cut that far through the tree, and that tree lives for decades. Because of that, you get growth off the side of that tree, whatever species is you're cutting that's appropriate. Could be 2 to 3 inches, an inch, whatever it is. And then you could take that time, that micromanagement time, when you have these bedding areas, you're cleaning them out, is to go back and then hinge cut the growth off of the hinge cut back down. What you're doing is creating a living bush on top of that base of hinge cut. A lot of those trees and root structures are going down in the ground. You create a giant bush of regeneration, plenty of food for deer. You're extending the life of those hinge cuts for food and for side cover. And if you're not taking advantage of that within 3 to 4 years of your initial hinge cutting, you really should. And you're not capturing the potential. If you don't go back in there 2 or 3 years later, especially 3 or 4 years later, right around there, and hinge cut back on top of hinge cuts, creating those living bushes and side cover onto the side so that deer can still move through the hinge cuts like they've always used them. You're just adding food back to that component of hinge cutting on your land. Really good practice. Now the 9th problem, and I see this, we could have started this with 1 or 2 or 3, but the 9th problem I see with hinge cutting, it's very important, is that your hinge cuts are actually open enough. I like 0 dead ends within those hinge cuts. So I don't want to create a situation where deer turn around a corner within those hinge cuts and they hit a dead end. We're making this a corn maze type. If you've ever gone to a corn maze, that's what hinge cuts should be, where they're never-ending supply of trails, travel corridors, passageways, openings, and deer can always turn and run and get out. There's no dead ends. When you're in large open ag areas and no predators, you can make this pretty tight, 1 foot or 2 wide, very tight, where a deer can't even hardly see out of this in any direction. You see brush 10 feet in front of their face, that's fine. When you get to large wooded areas, northern wilderness areas, it could be even a big wooded area in Kentucky or southern Ohio, deer are used to space. They want a little bit more open in the corridors that they're moving through, 3 or 4 feet. They want to be able to sit, and instead of seeing 10, 15 feet is acceptable in a northern Ohio ag region where there's not a lot of cover to put a lot of deer into. They're used to compartmentalizing, not seeing much. When you get into these large wooded areas and wilderness areas, you want larger passageways and larger bedding areas where deer would expect, and they're okay with only seeing 10 feet in front of their face in northern Ohio. That's not the case in a big Kentucky hill country of woods, open woods, or southern Ohio, or northern Minnesota, northern Michigan, northern Wisconsin, areas where they have a lot of cover and they're used to a lot of space. In those areas, you sometimes want to see 20, 30 yards in front of them. And when you add the predator factor in those areas, that extends the amount of balance and opening that you want within your hinge cuts. There is no one type of hinge cut that works everywhere. In fact, I'll see some of those tight hinge cut areas made in big woods or wilderness settings, and the deer will completely avoid them by 50 to 100 yards. It's just too tight for them to use. They want to be able to see, and so think big, think spacious. You can almost drive your truck through it. Never ending. It's open enough. You have that maze and pocket effect that's still in there. Just a lot bigger and more open for wilderness and big wood settings, and a lot tighter for big ag and open areas where deer used to be compartmentalized and stuffed into 30 deer into 20 acres because there's just not a lot of cover available. Number 10, with hinge cut bedding areas, the most important factor, so much of this is started by buck beds and the talk about buck beds, and it's really unfortunate, because I've seen a lot of clients that feel if we make this bed this certain way, that we're going to attract all the bucks in the area to this bedding location. And folks, you can't do that. It's a lot more complex than that. It really is. If that was the case, then it'd be so easy. I'd write about it all the time. I'd encourage clients to do that, but it does not start with buck bedding. In fact, the buck bedding and the locations that you place and that you choose to create this hinge cut for buck bedding, if you don't have the components of high quality afternoon food sources that you're attracting deer to every single day, if you don't have that in place first, if you don't have the screening along that food that dictates that does and doe family groups will bed as close to that food source as possible, which they want to do every day. They're the ones that bed in that layer system. So you have food, screening, does, and then you can create buck bedding. So if you're going into your quote buck bedding areas first and you're working on your hinge cuts there without doing all the other steps first, you're really working backwards and it's not going to work out for you. You have to have that food every day, then the screening, then the doe bedding, and then you have enough room for buck bedding after that. I've seen open timber next to food sources for 200 yards. Those does don't bed until they get 200 yards into the timber. So that's that first area bedding, and you're wasting all that cover between there and that food source. You can make thick cover right along that food source, screen the food source. Now you can take those does that were bedding 200 yards away, place them 50 to 75 yards, sometimes 25 yards from the food source, and then now that area 200 yards back is for those bucks. And on small properties, you have to think about that because you don't have a lot of space. I hope these 10 hinge cut pieces of advice and portions of hinge cutting that might apply to you or not, that you can take those and make sure that when you cut your timber this year, you're not wasting it, that you're actually putting hinge cuts in the right location. And heck, maybe you're not even creating hinge cuts in the first place, because again, it goes back to, you might not have the right timber. You might not need to make hinge cuts. You might have a lot of other priorities first. Hinge cuts are a great and awesome and powerful tool in the whitetail habitat manager's bucket of tools to use. But there's a lot of ways to use hinge cuts correctly. In fact, there's more ways to use hinge cuts incorrectly probably than they are to use hinge cuts correctly. I encourage you to use hinge cuts this year if appropriate. Follow a lot of this advice and you will succeed with hinge cuts. And that's my whole goal with this channel, again, is to make sure that you're on the right path with any of these habitat improvements and making sure that they're appropriate for you, that the deer use them, and that your efforts match the amount of success and reward that comes in from putting all your hard work and time into it this season.